Okay, I could hop in first, then hand it off to my two more senior people. I know probably answered this question a billion times at this point in their careers. Um, so when I think about the definition of racism, it might be a cop out, but I think about racism as the reproduction of the ideas of race, right? Racism serves to kind of hold intact those ideas of kind of innate genetic biological inferiority and difference. So when we talk about like anti-Black racism, right, it's those everyday practices, it's those cultural landmarks, it's those systems and institutions built to maintain that idea of innate Black inferiority. So when I think about racism, I think about anything, whether it be interpersonal actions, systems built, cultural manifestations that seek to, right, hold people in that kind of construct.
Mhm. I would
Yeah.
agree 100% with Dr. August. I think it's those manifestations and that cultural cast that black folks are put in. When you're talking about anti-Black racism, the only other thing that I'll add is it's coupled with the power dynamic, right? And racism can't really occur without the power to institutionalize it. And I think that's what makes anti-Black racism, the racism that we find so deeply ingrained into this culture, so problematic, because it has been weaponized against us by the people who have power to weaponize it against us, and have done that since really the founding of this nation.
Mhm. Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is maybe giving some practical examples of that power, which I think is vitally important in terms of the definition of racism. So issues such as redlining, someone actually having the power to determine where you will live and how you will live, governmental systems that determine if you're eligible for certain programs or not, situations such as the power to determine whether or not you do well in a certain program, right? The power to impact the lives of others is the thing that distinguishes racism from prejudice in my mind.
And then Dr. Smith, the ultimate piece of it too, being slavery, right? Kind of the fulcrum of it.
Mhm.
Um, so we definitely didn't want to leave that one out too.
That's correct.
And can you talk a little bit more about, you said slavery. Why does slavery still play a part of racism in 2023?
You know, for me, racism, Dr. Smith and all of us were just kind of convening on this idea of power, and racism, excuse me, slavery is the ultimate power, right? In terms of putting a whole group of people in bondage and forcing them to work, and then the vestiges of racism, I think, really grew from that, right? And that's, you know, the way that I think a lot of scholars have come to understand the roots of racism as coming out of a way to help us understand the kind of dehumanization that was put on people of color to be able to, you know, commit the atrocities against us that occurred, right?
Mhm.
So I think that is the through line from slavery to modern day anti-Black racism, right? This idea that, you know, although there was a constitution that said, you know, all men are created equal, obviously there was a whole body of people that weren't included as men, that weren't included as human, and that is therefore the start of racism, and everything, or one part of racism, an early part of racism, and everything anti-Black has grown from, you know, kind of that original idea. So that is one piece of the through line, right?
Mhm. And it runs to, if we bring it to a more contemporary or relatively contemporary, if you think about programs during the 40s and 50s for veterans that allowed for them to obtain housing, right? So white veterans were able to come back and take Long Island, for instance, Long Island, New York, and they were able to have homes in Long Island through the benefit of programs through having been in the military. Well, African-American men who were in the military were not afforded those same opportunities. Why is that important? Because those homes that they purchased for $100,000, $200,000 at that time, maybe even less than that, now are worth millions of dollars. So the descendants of those people who own those homes that were passed down, someone who is a grandchild of the person that was the original homeowner now has an asset in excess of $1 million, whereas someone who was the descendant of someone that did not get that opportunity does not have that asset. So they're not on equal on equal levels. And folks will say, well, you should be able to do the same thing I'm doing, but not take into account the fact that you had a huge head start because you have equity in excess of $1 million where I don't. So you're starting the race much further ahead than I am. And that's another one of those byproducts of the through line of being in a marginalized position from the beginning.
And I'll add in to just we're all psychologists, so I'll throw in like when it comes to our specific discipline, right? Enslavement and that anti-Black racism literally shaped the conception of the field. A lot of people might not know one of the very first diagnoses. I know that people here know, right? Drapetomania, right? The idea that to be enslaved and to desire freedom was the type of mania that required the quote unquote treatment, which was forced enslavement, institutionalization. And so when I talk about this, people are like, oh, of course, people were like racist back then. That makes sense. But as you move throughout the decades, right, you see a field that was prioritized eugenics. The very first, I think, 30 presidents of the American Psychological Association served in leadership for various eugenics organizations that were tasked with, again, institutionalizing Black people to remove them from the population, right? Based on, again, this idea of race, this innate genetic inferiority. You go to the 70s, I know some people here know about the protest psychosis, right? The idea that to participate in Black liberatory action in the 60s and 70s is a type of psychosis, a type of schizophrenia that, again, we're going to disproportionately institutionalize and incarcerate Black men. And again, these are kind of hallmark examples, but sometimes people lose the thread of how that connects today. And we do know the protest psychosis reshaped how we understand schizophrenia today. And so when we look at the stats that show Black people are disproportionately diagnosed with psychotic disorders versus white people who are diagnosed with mood disorders, right? The very expression of distress, of health, of healing, whatever that might look like, is shaped by the country's history of enslavement. And this borne out, I know a lot of people saw the story of Jordan Neely in New York, right? That's a hallmark example of, right, someone who's experiencing their own form of madness, and that's seen as dangerousness. And the white person that kills him raises $1 million to support him, right, in a couple of weeks, because again, that's how the country understands treatment, unfortunately, for Black people.
Right.
And I appreciate the history part you talk about, because so my next question about is racism still prevalent? Because as a professor, I teach cross-culture research and cross-cultural psychology. And I ask students, like, who's ever experienced racism? I would say maybe 1 out of 30 students said they've experienced racism. So they're not even sure what racism looks like in the modern time. So my question to the panel is racism more prevalent today? Why or why not?
Yeah, I would say, my thought on that is that it is just as prevalent because we are living in a society, in a country that has at its very foundation a system that is inherently racist, right? So there were things written into the Constitution or left out of the Constitution that still have to be legislated. Voting rights, right? Why do we have to even have that as a question, right? It is still something that can be taken away. And if we just run through the gerrymandering and people make up excuses to draw maps in the most bizarre any logical person knows that this makes no sense. And they have been on record saying that they are doing this so that they can maintain power. And it keeps the people who have the ability to vote and change things in a marginalized position so that power can be maintained by those who want to wield that power, who understand how to utilize the system to get the things they want, even when they are outnumbered. So this whole system is built on, this whole country rather, is built on a bed of lies, because you look at the people who were even engaged in creating it, they didn't even believe in what they were saying, because their actions are indicative of that. And that just continues to manifest today. If you look at the things that are happening in our political system, in our cultural system, just the way people are relating and understanding each other, yes, it is still very much alive.
And I would hop in and say, like, it's interesting what you said about your students. I feel like people, when they think about racism, they think about the almost like the stereotypical version of someone spitting in my face, calling me the N-word, right? And people might struggle to experience that if they grew up in maybe a predominantly Black neighborhood. I know from I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. Some of my family grows up in predominantly white neighborhoods. Working with kids, I'm dealing with a kid in therapy right now who goes to a predominantly white school. That quote unquote stereotypical type of racism still exists in abundance, right? My little cousin, it was just a news story where all the white kids in the crowd were chanting like monkey noises at his basketball team, right? So that kind of interpersonal racism still happens when you find yourself in these predominantly white environments. The difficulty, and this goes to what Dr. Smith was talking about and Dr. Woodland was talking about, is as you get to areas where maybe it's less, there are fewer white people, the racism becomes more about the power structures, right? You might not be able to see it face to face, right? It might not be a white face of racism, but it's literally organized. The policing response in your neighborhood, the investment, right? The food, the nutrition that's available to you, right? The investment in your schools, who's allowed to teach at those schools. It organizes the entire experience. And it becomes a little bit more difficult to see that when it's not a white face, right, organizing all of that. So I think it shifts based on all the ways we outlined how racism operates to open up the panel.
I agree with everything my colleagues have said. And the way that Dr. Smith started was the way that I actually was going to start. I think racism is just as prevalent, but maybe looks a little bit different. Thanks to the work of many of our forefathers and foremothers, right? Folks are not in bondage anymore. Most places we can buy a home in that neighborhood. If you have the money, which is another question. Sorry about this siren in the background. So there are some vestiges that our people have pushed through, but still, there are a number of other places where we continue to struggle. There was a report that recently came out that said that over the last 2 decades, Black people have lost 1.6 million people to early death as a result of the stress due to racism, due to health disparities, and a number of different things that are a result of the vestitudes of racism. So, for example, where I live in Washington, D.C., on the Black side of the city, if you will, in Ward 7 and Ward 8, where the population is 95% African-American or upwards, the life expectancy over there is 67 years old, right? If you live just across town, maybe a mile or so away, the life expectancy jumps up to 85, right? So we're talking about a whole 15 some odd years. And for Black men, the life expectancy is even lower, right? So in some cases, we're talking about a 20-year difference based on living right in a neighborhood that suffers the oppression of racism versus one that does not, right? And that speaks to how we talk about how racism plays, it has an impact on people's lives right now. It very much does, right? It's killing us. It is killing us. It continues to kill us, right? It continues to kill us earlier than any other group, right? Black men are more likely to die early, more likely to suffer from hypertension, diabetes, overweight, all of these kinds of things, stress, depression, right? All of that is a result of racism. So the through line is very thick, looks a little bit different now, but it's certainly still there.
So you
And it's
lead to
like we're carrying around 100 extra pounds every day that we
Right.
don't even think about. We have become so accustomed to doing it. That's just what we do. But if we realize that we could set that 100 pounds down, it'd be like, wow. You know, I travel a lot. And I remember I went to Australia, and for a couple of days I was walking around going, something's just weird, something's strange. And the third day I finally figured it out. When I would go in the shops, nobody was following me around. Like, even though Australia has its issues, they weren't following me around. I wasn't made to feel like a criminal. And I realized just how much, like, that felt so good to be free in that sense. It was like, wow, this is what it feels like. And even though I had traveled, you know, I've been to predominantly Black countries, to be in a predominantly white country and not have that feeling attached to it, it was like lifting that 100 pounds off. And so my goal is to ultimately get all of us to just take that weight off, and so we can be free of the racism. But we got a lot of work to do to get to that space. But
and Dr. Smith, I agree with you. When I did my first trip to Dubai and all the race stuff was happening in America, I just felt lighter because I didn't deal with those type of negative spaces when I travel. And Dubai has now become like my second home because I just don't have to deal with that here. But this leads to my next question. What are the major mental health concerns that have a relationship with racism? I think Dr. Woodland already said stress. Is there any other major mental health concerns that is related with racism?
I want to say two things. One is shout out to Dr. Bishop. I'm trying to get like Dr. Bishop so Dubai could be my second home. That's what we're aiming for. We're not there yet, but we're gonna get there. And the second thing, right? So stress, and I know Dr. Smith can speak to this. I know Dr. Woodland can too. Is one of the ideas from Black psychology, but like worldview, right? Like racism really shapes how people understand themselves philosophically, understand themselves spiritually, understands their goal and purpose in life. And we know so much of depression, anxiety, the idea of what it means to be a provider, what a family looks like. Again, it's shaped by these ideas of race and racism. Right? They're based in white supremacist ideas of the traditional family structure. They're based in white supremacist ideas of what work means and how much work should take up of your life. And if you don't engage in that, you're a failure as an individual to not just yourself, but to your family, right? So I say like racism shapes this entire worldview that guides how people interact with the people they care about, and again, that shapes every single mental health outcome, whether that be psychosis, whether that be depression, whether that be anxiety.
I think, depression and anxiety are certainly things that we see quite a bit. And, I point to as a practical marker of this, in 2016, after the election happened, for about 2 months, practically every person that came into my office, for whatever they were coming into my office for, had issues related to the energy and their feelings about the election and what was happening in this country. It was palpable, the feelings and the emotions that people, some people cried, some people were just very forlorn and just sad and depressed and anxious about what was going to happen, anxious about literally were they going to be safe walking around in their communities. So to me, it's a direct tie-in in that regard. It's like, I saw that for myself, the number of people that would come in unprompted and were impacted by what was happening. So absolutely, it impacts us.
And Dr. Woodland talked about this, touched on this a little earlier. I want to ask the question: does racism impact Black men and women the same way? Why not?
I mean, I think in a lot of ways it impacts us in the same way, but one way in particular that I was thinking about as you talked about racism and how it impacts us, and this is particularly for Black men, is that racism is one of the things that pushes Black men into legal system spaces, right? Whether it's the juvenile legal system, whether it's the adult legal system, and that ends up in a number of different problematic health outcomes for Black men and boys from being in those types of environments, right? So I think one way that racism impacts Black boys, and it's interesting, there's a book, and it's not so recent anymore, called Push Out. And I can't remember who the first name of the author is, Monique, I think, and I can't remember her last name. But this is a book about African-American girls and about how African-American girls end up being pushed out of school and pushed out of the system in a number of different ways. And I think that's true. And that is certainly a result of racism. I would say for Black boys, there's almost a push in, right? And when I say push in, I mean push into legal system settings, right? I mean, pushed into juvenile justice settings, pushed into criminal justice settings, right? And that, I think, is one unique way that racism works differently, right, as it pertains to Black men and Black women, right? And that's not to say that Black women aren't in part pushed into juvenile justice, and I don't want to say juvenile justice, I'll say juvenile legal system and criminal legal system, right? Adult legal system spaces, but not with the frequency of Black men, not with the frequency of Black boys, right? And they're often pushed out, often left out Black girls, while Black boys, like I said, are so frequently pushed in to these kinds of legal system settings. And that plays such a horrendous role in our psychology and our health.
And I think you're right about it, especially with boys. So I work in the jail, so I do groups there. And just the other night, we talked about every guy in my group was designated as special ed or emotion disturbed. And so they hit them at such an early age. It carries over through adulthood. And Black boys are more likely to receive these diagnoses compared to Black women. Not to say that Black women don't also have their issues, but this is how they start. They start with our Black boys of diagnosing them in an educational classification that leads to a more DSM-5 mental health classification. So I agree with you on those points. And Dr. Smith, you just talked about this earlier. Is there racism in mental health? I'm sorry. Is there racism in mental health treatment? If so, what does it look like?
Yeah. So I have so many people that come to me. I hear this probably once or twice a week. I was really looking for an African-American, and they'll say, I'm not racist, but I just wanted some. You're not racist. Listen, my practice was designed, when you look at my website, when you walk in my door, everything is a reflection of me. And as a result, a reflection of you. That's by design, because when I go to Duke, they have no problems making everything a glorification and a reflection of them. So you're gonna walk in my office and you're gonna feel comfortable that this is where you need to be. And so you think about, just with treatment, not having to explain to someone the microaggressions you're dealing with. Are you sure that happens? Is somebody following you around? That doesn't really happen. Maybe you're being paranoid. Maybe, right? You have to explain to your provider the reality of your situation. Whereas you come talk to me, I'm like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. That's exactly what happens. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we can deal with the issue, and you don't have to now explain to the person and give them a history lesson so they can help you. Other ways it comes out, if you look at testing, I was just doing an evaluation with an IQ test, right? We have this section where we have to ask information questions and vocabulary words. So I asked the young girl, what does obey mean? She said, it's a seasoning. And I was like, you're right. It is a seasoning, but that's not the answer that they're looking for. So technically, she would be downgraded for that. But she shouldn't be, because that is a correct answer. But the people who design the test don't appreciate the cultural component of the differences that exist in different cultures, and they want to have this global representation of what IQ is. So one of our mentors and scholars in Black psychology was one of the founders of the Black Psychologists Association, Dr. Robert Williams, created the Black Intelligent Test of Cultural Homogeneity. The BITCH test is the acronym for it. And he had all these questions that were significant for folks in the Black community. His point was to illustrate that just as there are things that we know in the Black community, there are things that are germane to the white community that don't necessarily apply to us. And if you're going to have a fair, unbiased perspective of a person's IQ, that needs to be taken into consideration. And unfortunately, it's not, because those that are in the positions of power, they don't have to consider where other people come from. They just make the assumption that this is what it is for everybody, and that is absolutely not the case.
Dr. August, I attended one of your presentations a couple months ago talking about anti-Blackness and dealing with mental health. How does this relate to this discussion?
Yeah, in so many ways, right? So, what Dr. Smith just shared, right, is building a mental health space that is completely culturally tailored to the realities of Black people. And unfortunately, like, based on what we said before, we know the history of this field. We know the history of mental health treatment is based in the exact opposite, right? Frantz Fanon said psychiatry is an auxiliary of the police, right? And so for the majority of this field's lifespan, it has been designed to oppress, to control, to surveil people, as opposed to Black people, as opposed to treating them. And so even this context, right, the very idea, I asked my students this, they're always surprised, like, where do the vast majority of people encounter mental health, quote unquote, mental health services for the first time? And they're surprised when they learn that it's in carceral settings, in jails and prisons, right? Because a lot of the systems are so inaccessible. So much the systems are based on these ideas of capitalism, these ideas of profit, right? The people who are allowed to license, right? Allowed to grant people the right to treat people. So your question is, right, how does it impact, the very nature of mental health treatment? It impacts every single aspect of it, right? What does treatment look like? Who's allowed to treat, right? What are you even targeting in treatment? So I know this is one of the questions for later, but we just know in various African civilizations and various Black communities, mental health treatment takes so many distinct forms, right? It takes place in community, it takes place in the barbershop, it takes place in the hair salon, right? And so for the longest time, the field did not, and still does not, recognize those places as the therapeutic solaces and oases that they are for our community. So long-winded answer to your question.
Dr. Woodland?
Yeah, no, I agree with, again, with what my colleagues wanted to just make it practical again, like Dr. Smith talked about. So right now I'm in the middle of a case with a gentleman who's on death row. And when I walked in to do his evaluation, one of the first things he said is, like many guys who I deal with say, doc, I don't deal too much with doctors. I don't deal with psychologists and all that stuff y'all do. right? And we talked a little bit more about it. And he said, you know, really smart guy. He said, you know, I always feel like the doctors who were in my life before, or the therapists, they were just saying everything else people wanted to hear, what people in the jail wanted to believe about me, what you know, other counselors, corrections officers saying exactly what it is they want to hear. And I said, you know, I've taken some time to read your record, and I think you're right. And to me, you know, that was it. Looking at his record was such an example of how psychologists, how psychiatrists, how mental health workers at times have colluded, right, to come up with what Dr. August talked about, the protest psychosis, or whatever name that we can give it. So for this gentleman who had a lengthy history of trauma, a lengthy history of suicide, being suicidal as early as 8, 9 years old, a lengthy history of abuse, obviously a trauma survivor. As soon as he got into the juvenile justice system at 13, the juvenile legal system at 13 or 14 years old, everything changed. His diagnosis changed from PTSD to conduct disorder, soon turned to antisocial personality disorder. You know, talking about this guy as if he's a sociopath, and never asking him about his trauma. Mm-hmm. Right? No one, once he got into the juvenile legal system, all the way through the adult system, it's like all of those things that happened to him before never happened to him, right? And they treated him as such. And every therapist, every psychologist that talked to him never, and the psychologists in this panel are shaking their head, and everybody else might not know, but trauma can affect people in really difficult ways, right? And kind of make people, I guess the best example that us as men can understand, and folks that I deal with a lot, are soldiers, right? And a lot of people may have contact with soldiers and individuals who come back from war with PTSD. And some of the things that we know about them are that they can be explosive. There can be low frustration tolerance. There can be periods of depression as a part of that PTSD, right? Now, if you don't treat the trauma, right, or a soldier, and you're just looking at the fact that, you know, they're explosive, they can have low frustration tolerance, they can become very angry, and those are the only things you're dealing with, you'll never get to the root of the problem, right? The very thing with the young people that we work with, if you don't catch trauma, if you don't have talk about it with them, make sure that they have a way to process it, then they'll be explosive, they'll be angry, and for our youth about that in being a way to push them into criminal settings. And so when he said that, I said, I hear it and I see it, and I want to acknowledge that for him. And I think that's the way that I see racism still playing such a huge part in the lives of the men that I come in contact with every day.
And Dr. Willing, your sound's going in and out. We heard you, but it's sometimes going in and out. But you reminded me of a case I had where I had a gentleman I had to evaluate, and the previous psychologist gave him a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. And I looked at what was the criteria. He did not pay his taxes, was one of the criteria they used to say that he was in poor social norms. And so I had to correct that, but they used, it was actually in the report, because he did not pay his taxes was a criteria for antisocial personality disorder. It's just unbelievable. We know you established that racism is there. How does, when we talk about racism with our families, does racism impact Black men in their relationship with their families? Why or why not?
I mean, absolutely it does. Historically, we see when you think about Black men and their inability to effectively take care of their family. I'll just give a personal example of this, right? My grandfather, who would have been born in the 20s and grew up in Southern Alabama, very racist, of course. And he was a person who never said, "I love you" to my father or any of his children until he was on his deathbed with dying with cancer. But that wasn't what he was about. He understood that I got to get these children to adulthood in a safe way. And so he showed his love through what he did. And, I recently found out that he was a white man in Alabama had called him a name and hit him. And he ended up killing that man and leaving Alabama and going to Miami to get away from it because he was not one to not defend himself. But the pressure of having to move his family around and hide, even as he's just taking care to defend, and at that time, he could have been lynched, as so many of our family and ancestors were. That's what would have happened had he stayed there. But he chose to fight back. So often when you don't fight back, and these things happen with him, how do you not defend your family? How do you watch people disrespect you and you be disrespected? What does that do to your psyche, to your emotional makeup? And so you turn to alcohol, right? Getting drunk. I need to just forget all this. You may feel like, well, since somebody beat me up out there, I'm going to come home and beat up my family, right? So you see abuse happening throughout families. And then those things get passed down generationally, right? Because people do what they see often, right? Children emulate what it is, the model that's presented by their parents. And so that racism has had a direct impact and continues to manifest in our families today. How many people have heard, "Keep your business out of the street"? Keep my business off the street. That is a direct, that saying, that whole way of being speaks to, I don't want the system to know about me and use that information in a negative way. And so we have to break through that. And now we got folks who understand that and who are providing in a different way. We have to break that down so people can recognize that, like Dr. Woodland's example, that there are people who get you, who really do want to help you, who aren't just out to make money or sign off on some numbers or what have you. That there are people who are genuinely in this to help you be your best self. And so that's I'll stop there for sake of time and everybody else getting an opportunity. But those are some thoughts on that.
You lead. Dr. Willie, want to say something?
Yeah, for me, I think the only thing maybe that I haven't heard said as of yet about racism, and I might have missed it, is just talking about the types, right, for Black folks and Black men in particular. One of those stereotypes is the stereotype of the deadbeat dad, right, and how that impacts us, and that, because it shapes how people understand Black men in relationships. And I guess Dr. August did talk about that. It kind of shapes how people look at us and how we look at ourselves, right? And I know I always like to cite this study because I think it's such an important one. And you guys are probably familiar with the study that the CDC did in 2018 of all fathers, right? And I want to make sure everybody in this call is aware of that study. So in roughly about 2018, the CDC did a study of some many thousands of fathers, and one of these other guys on the call will probably know it, the exact number, but I want to say it was upwards of 80,000 to 100,000 fathers of all different races. And they had, Black fathers, white fathers, Asian fathers. And what they found in this study is that Black fathers were more likely to read to their children, were more likely to play with their children, were more likely to be engaged with their children, and spent more time with their children than fathers of any other race. despite the fact that, you know, racism tells us and stereotypes tells us that Black men are deadbeat dads, in fact, we are the ones who are most likely to spend time with our children. Again, to read with our children, to play with our children, do the things that you think dads should do with their children, right? But we're not known for that. And I think that's one way that racism impacts us and misinforms us, right? And misinforms people about us and misinforms us about us, right? And our value. The other thing I want to add to that, though, and I think is an important piece of this, is Black dads also were less likely, unfortunately, to be married to the mothers of their children. Right? And that the way that the researchers talked about it and the way that we understand that is really an issue of socioeconomic status, right? So what does that mean? It means when you put Black fathers that make a certain income level against white fathers who make a certain income level, right? The likelihood of them being with the mother of their child is the same, right? Okay. However, regardless of whatever income level, right? This is the important piece. This is the kicker. Rich, poor, right? We still spend more time with our children. And that to me is golden and something that we should be proud of and know. And I think a way, again, that racism misinforms us.
Yeah, and the only two things I was going to add, and I know we wanted to get through all these questions, Dr. Bishop. So
we're not gonna get through all. We're just gonna play this out.
I hear that. Is exactly that point, right? So Frantz Fanon says the oppressed will always believe the worst about themselves, right? And so the idea that we have, right, that we know this, the CDC study came out, people read it, and today, again, you still have a lot of people discuss the failures of Black fatherhood. Right, it's this pervasive idea because, again, at this point, I've heard it more coming from other Black people in ways culturally we need to do better, as opposed to at this point from white people, because these ideas have become so ingrained. And the only thing I would add to this also is even the idea, right? We know that family structure looks different based on socioeconomic status. The idea that some forms of family structure are inherently inferior. You know, I know people who, my father's side is from Haiti. You know, I'm sure people have these type of households where it's like, yeah, the aunt, the uncle lives there, the cousin lives there, maybe the father lives over there with the other mother and the sister and the cousin. Like the family lives in all these places. The children are well taken care of. They grow up in communities. So this idea that just because it's not the traditional mom, father, sister, and the brother with the pet and the white picket fence means that the family structure is somehow less sufficient, right? It's another one that's based in white supremacy, right? So that's the only thing I'd add right there.
Well said, Dr. August.
So I'm asked you to tell us what is white supremacy, especially from Dr. Kreslin. How do we define that?
Oh man, so I actually shout out to Dr. Afia Bilashaka. She just did an introduction to Black psychology course, and that was my largest exposure to her work. And I know I have two people here who could offer correctives if I stray off the path too much. I don't know how deep to go. I just know, again, a lot of her theory, especially with the ISIS papers, talk about a lot of white almost psychological politics being governed by a fear of replacement, a fear of inferiority, right? A larger inferiority complex that governs how that they need other people to be inferior. They need to be in control of other people. They need to kill other people, right? Otherwise, their genetic makeup will be rendered extinct. Right? And so within her conception of it, right, you have to understand that by its very nature, as she would say, whiteness is inferior. And the entire makeup, the entire societal makeup that we have is set up to make you oblivious to that fact, as I understand it.
Yeah, racism. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Smith.
Race is a made-up construct, right? It's absolutely created for a purpose to an end. And I like to make it plain for folks. If you think about when you are in middle school, right? That is the developmental age where things are the worst, right? In terms of how peers relate, because your body's changing, you're trying to fit in, you don't want to be the one that's teased. So if you can put somebody else down first, that can raise you up. So the concept of I need to diminish somebody else to lift myself up, right? You see that play out. That's the same thing that happens with white supremacy. I need to put this whole body down. If you think about just how, as a rational person, the only reason you don't like me is because my skin is a little darker than yours. That's the only reason you don't like me. Like, that should be a diagnosis that we study, and that's in the DSM-5, because that makes no sense. And yet this whole society is built on this premise of maintaining power over others, only for that very reason. So that's how I conceptualize it in a way that makes it, plain and simple to understand.
And I think what Dr. Willen talked about earlier too, so we know from the definition is prejudice, discrimination, stereotype, and power. So all those play a role in the way that we look at this. I want to switch gears. How can we be proactive by our mental health as it relates to the impact of racism? What can we do? What can we do?
I'll say self-care is just so important, right? I think what we've talked about tonight is just the stress as a result of racism and how that impacts our body, how that impacts our minds. And the best way to respond to stress is by taking care of yourself, right? One, understanding the stress. So if you have to go through therapy to be able to process it, be able to kind of check in mentally, right? And figure out what's happening, but also doing those other things that are important, taking walks, going to the gym, making sure that you can have strong relationships. And, obviously as a fraternity, this is a really important part of it as well, brotherhood, right? And having connections with people and folks that you can talk to, not only including your significant other, right? But also, your friends, having friendships. All of those things are important parts of being healthy, right? And I think the other piece of it that I would add that might be uniquely important for Black men, and I think allow Black men to feel especially healthy, is supporting other. I think for Black men in particular, there's a special kind of, all right, I feel good because not only am I supporting me and doing those things that I need to do, but I'm also get over whatever it is that they're going through. And I think, that's just a unique space that I always find Black men, right? Whether it's, out on the football field, helping these young guys, or on the basketball court, or in the classroom, or wherever it may be, or in a context like this, right? I think those are kinds of things that, Black men tend to get up for and feel helpful about themselves.
Yeah, I think when I was in graduate school, my frat brothers were my biggest support because I was dealing with racism in my classroom. And I had to go outside the class, being the only Black male in my whole program, to go outside and say, this is what's happening, and be able to kind of process and bring it back to the classroom and really confront it. And I think that is important. But what about the brothers who are at jobs and it's a lot of microaggression every day at work? How do they manage that racism on a daily basis? Because they got to eat. So it's important for them to try to do their job, but still manage the racism. Do you have any recommendations about how to manage that?
I would say that mindset is very important and how we reframe our mindset. Neely Fuller I love him. He gives a great example of how we are in control of how we choose to think and respond to something, right? The whole mantra, sticks and stones may break my bones. He's like, if somebody called me the N-word, I wouldn't even respond because I know who I am and they're not talking to me. That does two things. One, it's like you create a force field around yourself and you make a decision that I'm not responding to anything anybody says that doesn't speak to my humanity. Number two, it disarms the other person because they expect you to respond and they don't know what to do when you don't. So it changes, it shifts the narrative, it shifts the dynamic. So this is important for us because we spend a lot of time worrying about things that we have absolutely no control over. I often say to people, a person that is the leader of the KKK was likely born to people who were leaders of the KKK. And that's what they were taught. That's what was infiltrated into their mind from the time of their birth until the present time. So I shouldn't expect them to be a champion for civil rights when all they've been fed is that type of negativity. So why would I allow myself to get angry about what they might do, right? Now, hear me out. I'm not saying you shouldn't get angry. Anger is a natural human emotion, but it's what we choose to do with that emotion that makes it positive or negative. So as long as they stay over there and do what they're doing and they don't encroach upon my space or encroach upon my civil rights or encroach upon my freedom, they're supposed to be exactly who they are. And if you understand the balance of nature, the balance of life in terms of light and dark, joy and pain, Frankie Beverly has a whole song about it, right? There's this balance of life. There's good and evil. So accept it for what it is and make a choice, which is my personal mantra, is living my life fully 86,400 seconds every single day. I choose joy. I choose happiness every single moment that I possibly can, because none of us know when our last day is going to be. If our life expectancy is 80 years, then if you're over 50, you're in the third quarter of your life, right? If you're over 60, you're in the fourth quarter of your life. And as you start to, get older, what you can do tails off. So how do you want to spend your time? Do you want to spend your time angry, frustrated, upset? Or do you want to spend your time enjoying the latter part of your years? For me, I'm choosing to enjoy it, right? If I got to go out and fight a war and battle and do what I need to do to bring things to my community, I can do that and I can let it go and also focus on goodness for taking care of myself. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I love both of the responses, and I want to answer really quickly, I guess, on three levels. One, again, self-care was a great response, right? Like we all know, and for people who don't know about the idea of John Henryism, right? The idea that when you experience racism, all you have to do is work harder, right? Suppress whatever feelings you're experiencing. We know that's linked to a lot of the excess stress and the cardiovascular health problems that particularly Black men have. Right? And so this piece about self-care, this piece about finding those safe spaces that you can go, discuss, talk, process is essential. It's essential because that stress doesn't evaporate. That stress stays in the body if it's not processed, right? And so I'm gonna, big up the Association of Black Psychologists, right? We do have the Salbona Healing Circles. Like if you're a Black person in this space, there is a free healing circle going on right now that you could attend, right, next week. There's one going on Monday that you can attend for free, right, next week. We have those running consistently. So those free kind of services that are based in your experience allow a safe space to process those day-to-day exposures. So that's number one. Number two is it might be, right, Dr. Bishop, your question was those people who are experiencing those day-to-day microaggressions, right? Sometimes I feel like mental health treatment is so about helping people tolerate what should not be tolerated, right? Especially when you talk about certain cognitive behavioral therapies that are held up by Western professionals. I'm doing work with a kid who is experiencing consistent anti-Blackness. Every time he had a concussion and he was frustrated, they thought he was being violent. He posted a rap lyric, they thought he was going to shoot up the school, right? Every single dimension, anytime he expressed anything, it was taken to 10. And this was distressing. His parents were starting to believe it. My role there as a therapist wasn't to, okay, how do I help him experience this school? What I helped him do was like, we got to get you out of this school, right? We're in the process, I've talked to several counselors, several school psychologists, and we're in the process of getting him to move to a different school where that is not the culture, because that was, right, destroying him. We pull from history. A lot of Black people, when they first were enslaved and brought to the US, their initial project wasn't, right, these massive critiques like we're doing of racism, white supremacy. Their initial project was, I need to get away from this. Right? It was building maroon villages, maroon societies. It was fleeing to the mountains, it was fleeing to the woods and recreating African societies. You know, I say that to say, in addition to the processing of the day-to-day distress, it's finding those safe, again, like Black spaces that are created for and by you, right, to hold your authentic self. What that looks like practically, like let's say within the discipline, I'm fortunate to hear that every one of these people in this panel with me has played a really big role actually in my development, right? So when I first got to grad school in psychology, one of the widest fields you could possibly imagine, where I'm talking all these ideas about anti-Blacks and nobody knows what I'm talking about, right? I find the Association of Black Psychologists, right, where Anthony Smith, Dr. Chris Bishop have been so foundational, right, in their contributions to the code of ethics and ceremony and ritual. That's where I found a home outside of the everyday experiences of anti-Blackness in psychology. When I was dealing with, I was getting ready to interview for internships, and I was talking like I'm talking with you all right now about every aspect of this. Every internship said no, except for the one where Dr. Malcolm Woodland, right, at the time was the chief, because he understood, he saw that. He had co-created a space where that was valued. And afterwards, I probably could have taken a job with Chris Bishop. I ended up in Boston, but if I had wanted to do that, that was right there. Right? So these are people who have, in addition to tolerating the everyday anti-Blackness, have created spaces that exist outside of that, right, to help people thrive. And so contributing to that is I think also, like, again, a pro-social way of dealing with anti-Blackness, is making spaces that exist somewhat outside it. And the last thing really quickly is, you know, the larger political project I know everybody here is also engaged in, right? Dr. Malcolm Woodland talked about how our ancestors fought so that we didn't have to be enslaved. And all of us play a political role, right, in pushing society to be further and further from these white supremacist ideals that govern so much of our day-to-day lives, right? Recreating cities, abolishing particular institutions that we know are based in our harm and our oppression. So I would say, again, within Black psychology, you almost have to engage on every single level. It's the individual, like Dr. Smith spoke so eloquently about, how do I process this in the everyday level? And then it's also, right, the co-creation of space and the shifting of society so that people can authentically thrive.
Thank you. Brother Hoggabook, can you give the mic to Brother Orrin Howard so he can do our giveaways?
Dr. Bishop, I want to jump in with one more thing too, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
And it's just to add on to what Dr. Augustine and Dr. Smith were saying. But, you know, finding that space, I call it finding your HBCU, right? And what was the HBCU for me? An HBCU was a place where my culture was celebrated, where my intellect was celebrated. Obviously, I had deep disagreements and arguments with people, right? But the arguments were thoughtful and engaging and push people to think, right? But never at question. And I was always around people who I thought respected me, respected my intellect, and were friends, right? in this battle. And I think when you find yourself in spaces where those microaggressions occur, you have to still find your HBCU, right? Find those other Black people, find other folks in that space who celebrate you, who you celebrate, who you can push back and forth with, who you can commune with, who you can talk things through. I think that is critically important. So if, particularly for folks at PWIs, find your HBCU, go to the Black Student Union, right? Go to, all of those other spaces where we are, right? And I think that's another way to battle those microaggressions when you find yourself in those spaces. And that's how I've always thought about it. Malcolm, where's your HBCU in this, right?
Thank you. I'm gonna turn over to Brother Howard for a moment.
Well, I just want to say how amazing it is, not just to have the panelists, but if you look at the roster of the brothers that are participating in some of the things that they're doing, the credentials that they have and the experiences they have, how often is it do we as men of color get together and just build? And so this is an amazing time of reconciliation and understanding within our community. And I celebrate everybody that decided to be here. So we wanted to continue this by giving a couple giveaways. Some of the books are classics, and some of the books are new. We want to give away a couple copies of Dr. Smith's book, No Trauma, No Drama. And the winners of that book is Brother Jason Jordan Smith, I believe from Annapolis, and Brother Herb Jenkins from Baltimore. So congratulations on that. Then we want to give out some classics. I know some of the panelists are familiar with Dr. Joy DeGruy's work in post-traumatic slave syndrome, and that'll be going out to Brother Miles Lewis, I believe from Norfolk. And How to Be Anti-Racist is a classic that we want to give out to Brother Paul Stiles from Bowie alumni. And the last one is a classic from Dr. Naeem Akbar, New Visions for Black Men. We want to give that out to Brother Philip Hayes from Danville. So congratulations, Noops, on getting that. And let's keep this momentum going.
So we will be reaching out to you through email to get your addresses so we can get those books out to you. Now we're going to open, we hit about, it's 8:12. We'd like to open up discussion from our audience of any particular question to our panelists. And I guess you can raise your hand or just, let's see, gallery. Anyone have a question for our panelists?
Brother Bishop, are they unmuted to
I
be able
believe
to
so.
do that?
Yeah, Brother Hugabook, are we open for questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Take any comments or questions. Is the chat also open, Brother Bishop?
Yeah, I see Brother Gladden.
Brother Gladden is.
Brother Gladden, go ahead.
First of all, I'm a little disappointed I didn't win a book, but I'm gonna carry on. Just great topics, and just with, I'll just say, current events and just DC and Baltimore, proliferation of, I guess, say youth. I'll just say hip hop culture, Black youth, and even males and females. Just seems to be a lot of violence and a gun culture, and the talking down of Black youth. Just you have, I know you get that a lot. Do you just have any comments on it, or just anything? Because it seems to be in the news so much now.
For me, I think our young people are hurting right now. And I think that's coming out in so many different spaces, whether it be school, whether it be our interactions with one another. I, I don't think our young people are the only people that are hurting. I think the pandemic really did a number on the world, and certainly people here in the United States. We know that, and we have been talking about it for some time, that after the pandemic ended, after, you know, we lost so many people. How many people did we lose in this country? Did we hit 2 million?
Also,
Yes.
I know we went over 1 million, 2 million people. And much of that was disproportionately shouldered by our community, right? So when you have that kind of grieving, when you have that kind of anxiety, that kind of depression, there's going to be a fallout afterwards. There is definitely going to be a fallout afterwards. And I think some of what we're seeing, some of that anger, some of that trauma. Remember, at the beginning of this, we talked about soldiers and PTSD and grieving, right? And the explosive behavior, the little frustration tolerance, right? That's some of the things that we're seeing from our young people at this very moment. And I think that helps us understand kind of what's happening, right? We are in the middle of the mental health crisis that everybody talked about during the pandemic. We said, you know, after this pandemic is done, right, or it starts to take its course, there's going to be a reckoning. There's going to be a mental health pandemic. And I think some of what we're seeing right now is just that.
And I would say, you know, this is one of, if not the most violent country in the world. I mean, it was founded on violence. And folks are very protective about their Second Amendment rights, even though when that was developed, AK-47s weren't invented. So it's like, what do you expect to come out of a space that is so violent, but more violence? Violence begets violence. And so the answer is, for me, the question is, why isn't there more violence? Because I would expect it to be even more, because that's what we are putting forth. And other people around the world, they're looking at us going, why do y'all need so many? When I travel places, I get asked that question all the time. Why do y'all have so many guns there? I was in South Africa. I was like, y'all got a lot of barbed wire around the houses. Say, yeah, but y'all got a lot of guns. Oh, touche. Okay, you win.
Yeah. You want to go to the next one? Could I hop on with this one?
go, please go.
Yeah. And so I was thinking about the framing around it too, right? The level of you know, hip hop culture was mentioned, and when I completed my internship at the DC courts, I tried to ask every kid that I evaluated, a lot of people who were there for like gun related arrests. What are a couple of wishes? If I could give you a few wishes, what would you wish for? And almost all of them wished for safety, right? They wished for safety for themselves. They wished for safety for their family. They articulated that through money. Like, I wish I had enough money, I could move my family out of DC. I could buy my mom this thing. Then maybe I get myself a car and some Yeezys after that. But first and foremost, I need to get my family out of DC, right? It's this desire for safety. And so we have what I saw was like a generation of kids who were doing their best to be safe in the ways that this country tells them is what they're supposed to do. When people, again, to Dr. Smith's point, when people talk about the First Amendment, the Second Amendment right, and the amount of guns, the conservative logic is always, look, we need a good person with a gun. That's how you keep yourself safe in the society. And so what we're seeing is the representation of conservative logic, where you have a lot of kids who are trying to protect themselves. They're trying to protect the kids that they grew up with, right? from the sheer amount of violence that exists around the community. Sometimes we think about these things so understandably, like sociologically. I interviewed a kid who said, like, I walked out of the barbershop one time, I got shot. I don't know why they did that to me. What else am I supposed to do? Other than get a gun, right, and try to protect myself. And so what we witness often is, right, this juvenile, it's an adolescent logic, because these people are so new to life and are doing their best to protect the things that they care about, doing their best to move their families to places that they dream might keep them safe. And so when I think about, right, this epidemic of violence and how it's been treated with, again, increased detention and increased incarceration. Shout out to Community Wellness Ventures in DC, because they're one of the few people I saw doing the actual work of healing with those kids, right? As opposed to saying, like, okay, if we just put these people in prison or juvenile detention, they'll be better, versus like, no, there's actual authentic conflicts going on here. Right? You're mad because this person shot your friend, then you shot his friend. Let's bring all these kids together. Let's have these conversations. But let's mediate some type of agreement, because y'all all want the same thing. Nobody wants to get shot. And the research shows that's what's more effective. But unfortunately, again, we live in a country that's based on the surveillance and control of Black people. And so you have a divestment from those things that authentically work when you're working with the kids who want to be safe, right? Versus this just investment in consistently, again, over-policing, over-arresting, incarceration, that we know we're the capital of the world in terms of incarceration. We know it doesn't work. We know guns don't keep anybody safe. So unfortunately, we have a lot of Black youth who are dying because of that.
Yeah, I just got a message, came across my screen, someone got shot in DC. I want to recognize our chair. See, he was here a second ago. Brother Dr. Stephen Hamlet had a question, but I think he must have to step off for a second. We'll see if he comes back. I do have a question. So as we know, I think is it 12% of psychologists are Black males, or no, are Black, and I think maybe 2 or 3% may be Black males.
Listen, that's 4%. 4%.
Okay, we have 4%. We have still 4%. How do we help, right? Because I know Dr. Smith's office is full. I know Brother Howard office full. Like, we can't service everyone. So how do we get people who need treatment in the doors? If they can't find someone who like us, is there other safe spaces? How do they assess if that's a safe space for them to get some type of treatment?
Yeah,
sorry?
that's something I spent a lot of time thinking about, because I always try to serve the people that come. I just feel an obligation for that. And as a result, I'm constantly overbooking myself, but it's just hard for me to tell people no, when I know they need help and when I know that I can help them. And not that I'm the only person, but a lot of times there aren't people who are gonna bring it the way that I bring it and understand it in that way. So one of the things that I did, I wrote a book to kind of help people, and thought that would be a way for people to at least get some of the knowledge, some of the things that I talk about, some of the themes that I talk about in terms of generational trauma and how to overcome it, how to heal ourselves, and put that out so people can access that and do their own work, and then supplement that with going to see whoever is in their community or in their culture that can help them kind of process out some of the things that are raised through thinking about the concepts and doing the exercises in the book. That's one of the things that I came up with to help deal with that issue.
Any other?
Yeah, and Dr. William, please.
Yep.
I was just gonna say, do kind of something that Dr. August was talking about earlier, which is places like the Association of Black Psychologists, right? And these aren't only mechanisms to be able to find fellowship, and communion and learn and mentorship. But you know, they also have a network of psychologists across every state, right? And if you go and look at the Association of Black Psychologists website, they will list psychologists in your state, African American psychologists who probably have similar ideas as the folks on this panel, right? About our community, about ways to help. And I think it's just an important resource that's underutilized. So, you know, looking at things like the Black psychologists and obviously Black social workers, Black psychiatrists, all of those folks, is that community that exists out there. And we, you know, sometimes you just have to know where to look.
And the thing I would add, and this might be bad for business, but I would say psychologists are fantastic. And even if you're a white person in America, right? So I think America probably has the most psychologists of any country, point blank period. There are not enough psychologists for the white people. So even if we got to the same percentage of Black people or psychologists as white people, or like, we would not be able to meet the need. And so I go back to having to, some people use the word, the language of decolonization, but making care accessible to the community, right? That means handing the tools over to the community. So Dr. Smith talked about, like, yeah, here's this book, right? We're going to do these community trainings, right? The Sal Boney Healing Circles we do community trainings. The Emotional Emancipation Circle, they do community trainings. Project Let's, the Institute for the Development of Human Arts, they do community trainings to equip people with the tools to provide care, right? Mental health first aid, psychotherapy, training barbers and hairstylists in how to treat people with various mental health conditions. Unfortunately, right, I think I'm great at what I do. I know these three men on this panel are great at what they do. And there's likely not going to be enough of us in the near future, in the far future. And so I feel like transforming this model from the expert to creating communities of care is where it has to go. Because otherwise, again, there's just not enough, again, experts to meet the mental health need of people.
I put in the chat 2 resources, Whole Brother Mission, and they're there to help Black men in mental health. Even if you don't have insurance, they find ways to help you. And I also put absci.org. They also have a directory of Black psychologists in your state, in your area. So if you look in the chat, you'll see those 2 resources I provided you. It is 8:28, so we're going to be ending our program. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Woodland, Dr. August, and Dr. Smith, for coming to us today and sharing your knowledge, your experience, your message to the Brothers of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated in the Eastern Province.